January 1981. A studio above a shop on Brook Street in Mayfair. Elizabeth Emanuel wraps a tape measure around the waist of a 19-year-old named Diana Spencer and writes down the number. By July, that number will be wrong. The dress will be too large, too wrinkled, too theatrical, too heavy, too young, too much. The train will be 25 feet long. The marriage will last 15 years. And if you knew how to read the dress, the whole disaster was already there before Diana reached the altar. The first contact came on January 8, 1981, weeks before the engagement was publicly announced. Elizabeth Emanuel was in the Brook Street showroom with a client when the phone came through. She ran upstairs to answer it, already impatient. No one else had picked up, and then heard who was on the line. She stayed upstairs long enough that her half-dressed client downstairs could hear celebrating through the floor. When Elizabeth finally came back down, she said nothing. She couldn't. David and Elizabeth Emanuel were barely older than Diana herself, described, even at the time, as almost as young and gauche as the bride. Their studio had operated for less than a decade, launched fresh out of fashion college, their first major commissions still recent enough to remember individually. They weren't, in January 1981, a household name. What they were about to become was inseparable from what they were about to make. The commission they described as the biggest secret we will ever have to keep would define everything that followed. Before the first toile was cut, they had already installed heavy window blinds across every window that faced the street, locked their sketches and fabric swatches in a safe, guarded around the clock by 2 security men, Jim and Bert, on 12-hour rotations, and started placing false-colored threads in the rubbish bins outside. Because photographers were going through their waste looking for scraps of ivory taffeta. Because editors and picture desks across Fleet Street had been told the commission was coming and would pay for a blurry photograph of a sketch. The design was already being called, even before it was finished, the most closely guarded secret in fashion history. Diana arrived for fittings under a different name. In the studio records, she was Deborah Cornwall. She came through the Brook Street entrance, usually after a drive from the palace that the press corps had tailed through the streets, camera lenses trained on the windows of the car. By the time she reached the studio, the staff had been briefed. Nothing discussed in the workroom left the workroom. The Emanuel's mothers were brought in to do the needlework. Their studio assistant, Caroline, worked alongside her own mother. Hired seamstresses who might gossip at a pub weren't an option. The risk was too specific, too costly. Every hand on the dress was a hand they trusted personally. The garment being built in those rooms was extraordinary in its specifics. Ivory silk taffeta, the fabric woven by Stephen Walters of Suffolk, not just bought off the bolt, but specifically sourced from a British supplier at a time when patriotic production was part of the brief. Antique Carrick-Macross lace that had originally belonged to Queen Mary, cut and reattached to the gown, something genuinely old, in the traditional sense, worked into something brand new. 10,000 mother-of-pearl sequins and pearls, each one hand-sewn, arranged in a heart motif on the fitted, boned bodice, the embroidery continuing along the waist, the hem, the long train. Nearly 300 feet of tulle underneath the skirt to hold the silhouette's architectural shape. A veil stretching 153 yards. An 18-karat gold horseshoe charm sewn into the petticoats for luck. A small blue bow stitched into the interior of the waistband as the traditional something blue. And the train. 25 feet of ivory taffeta and antique lace, the longest train in the history of royal weddings. David Emanuel later said they had discovered the previous record stood at 23 feet, and that Diana herself had participated in the decision. The Emanuels were presenting options. Shall we make it 23 foot? Shall we make it 25? Diana chose 25. That choice is worth holding before the forensics begin, because it complicates the easy version of this story. Diana wasn't a passive subject draped in fabric while an institution imposed its will on her body. She stood still through hours of fittings without complaint. She ran upstairs at the beginning of each session to say hello to the seamstresses by name. She was enthusiastic, Elizabeth Emanuel recalled. The sessions had a lightness to them, a sense of occasion that Diana seemed genuinely to feel rather than perform. She wanted the longest train in royal history. She wanted what Elizabeth Emanuel described as transformation, a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, in the designer's phrase. She left the aesthetic to the Emanuels and their sense of drama, but the dimensions were negotiated, not imposed. What does that mean for the thesis? It means the institution's power operated at a level deeper than direct instruction. Diana hadn't arrived at the Brook Street studio with the fairy tale handed to her by a palace official. She'd arrived understanding, in some fundamental way, that this was what the moment required of her, that the role she had entered called for exactly this kind of excess, this kind of spectacle. She had been 19 years old, working as a nursery assistant in Pimlico, with no roadmap for what being engaged to the heir apparent actually meant. And in the absence of any other language, she had reached for the fairy tale that everyone around her was already narrating. The institution didn't need to instruct her. It had already shaped the world she was reading from. But the complications inside the studio don't end with Diana's enthusiasm. Between the January measurements and July, her body kept changing. The bodice that fit at one fitting didn't fit at the next. Elizabeth Emanuel confirmed this on record to WWD years later. Diana's waist had dropped to 23 inches by the time she walked down the aisle, and the bodice had to be rebuilt every time she came in, not adjusted, not taken in a centimeter here or there. Rebuilt. Sources conflict slightly on the starting measurement. Elizabeth Emanuel's own People magazine account puts the beginning at around 26 to 27 inches. At least one earlier source suggests 29 inches at initial contact, which might reflect a different stage of the process. There is no conflict on the end point, and the operational detail carries more weight than the exact starting number. The dress's bodice wasn't made once. It was made over and over, each iteration chasing a body in the process of changing. The cause is documented through retrospective accounts. What we know about Diana's inner life in 1981 comes almost entirely from tapes she recorded for Andrew Morton in 1991 and 1992, a decade after the wedding, after the marriage had effectively ended. She later confirmed their accuracy. But she was 30 years old when she made them, narrating an origin story she already knew the end of. What she described in her own words was bulimia nervosa, beginning during the engagement period. The causes she identified were multiple: low self-esteem, isolation, the pressure of constant scrutiny, feelings she struggled to articulate about a life that had changed too fast. Not a single clean cause. A convergence, some of it structurally connected to the role she had entered, some of it more complicated than that, and the historical distance makes any simple attribution an overclaim. What isn't complicated? Every time Diana left Brook Street, the Emanuels locked the new bodice back in the safe. Jim and Bert took over from the day staff. The blinds stayed down. In the morning, it started again. The Emanuels had also prepared a backup dress, a simpler version in pale ivory silk taffeta with a pearl-embroidered bodice, a V-neck, and 3/4 sleeves, with scalloped embroidery on the hem. in case the original design leaked to the press before the wedding. The alternate design shared the fundamental silhouette, but without the enormous gigot sleeves, without the sheer theatrical excess of the primary gown. It was a contingency plan for a catastrophe that never arrived. Elizabeth Emanuel later said she doesn't know where it went, it just disappeared. The official gown was delivered to Clarence House on July 28, 1981. The bill was dated August 6th and sent to Diana's mother. 1,000 guineas. Elizabeth Emanuel's father had decided the amount. "We would have given it to Diana for free," Elizabeth said years later. The guineas were his idea of something romantic. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, a house her family rented from Queen Elizabeth II, whose younger sons, Andrew and Edward, had been Diana's childhood playmates. The Spencer family had been entangled with the British royal family for generations. Her grandmothers had both served as ladies-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. When her father inherited the earldom in 1975, she became Lady Diana Spencer. The aristocratic lineage was entirely real, deeply documented, not a casting decision. Her formal education was another matter. She failed her O-level exams twice and left Westheath Girls' School at 16. A term at a finishing school in Rougemont, Switzerland in 1978, then back to London. A series of low-paying jobs. Dance instructor for youth until a skiing accident took 3 months out of her schedule. Then house cleaner for her sister Sarah and a few friends. Babysitter, hostess at parties. By 1980, she was a nursery assistant, not a teacher, a distinction multiple biographers note carefully, at the Young England Kindergarten in Pimlico. On days off, she was in the flat at Coleherne Court in Earl's Court with her 3 flatmates, borrowing each other's clothes, talking about ordinary things. She was 19 years old. She had been 19 for most of the year she spent becoming one of the most photographed women on Earth. Charles first noticed her seriously at a polo match in the summer of 1980. His own biographer, Jonathan Dimbleby, would later write that Charles began to think seriously of her as a potential bride, and that this realization arrived, notably, without any apparent surge of feeling. He invited her sailing aboard the royal yacht Britannia, then to Balmoral. He proposed on February 6, 1981, in the nursery at Windsor Castle. Diana later told Morton she had initially thought it was a joke. She'd been standing there expecting a different kind of conversation and found herself suddenly, irrevocably engaged to the future king. The engagement was kept secret for about 2.5 weeks. On February 24, 1981, it was announced publicly, and the particular life Diana had been living in Earl's Court was over before she had time to say goodbye to it properly. Within days, photographers were stationed outside her building before dawn. Her face appeared on front pages she hadn't agreed to. She moved first to Clarence House, then to Buckingham Palace itself, where biographer Ingrid Seward later documented that her life was incredibly lonely. The palace's daily rhythms, its unspoken protocols, its precise social calibrations, none of it had been explained to her. She was expected to know, or to learn by observing, or to be corrected privately when she got it wrong. At their first joint public engagement on March 9, 1981, a charity event at Goldsmiths Hall in aid of the Royal Opera House, she wore a strapless black taffeta evening gown by the Emanuels. She had thought it looked appropriate, sophisticated, grown up. She was walking into Charles's study to leave when he looked at her and said, "You're not going in that dress, are you?" She said she was. He said it was black, and black was only for mourning. She said she wasn't part of his family yet. Later, recording the memory for Morton, she described the full shape of the evening. "I was quite excited," she said. "I got this black dress from the Emanuels. and I thought it was okay because girls my age wore this dress. I hadn't appreciated that I was now seen as a royal lady. And then, it was a horrendous occasion. I didn't know whether to go out of the door first. I didn't know whether your handbag should be in your left hand or your right hand. I was terrified, nearly sick. She wanted to go back to Coleherne Court. She said exactly that on the tape. She wanted to sit and giggle with her friends and borrow clothes and talk about silly things. Just being in her safe shell again. Princess Grace of Monaco was at that event. She noticed the fear on Diana's face and quietly maneuvered her away for a few minutes into a private room. Diana poured out her sense of isolation, her dread about what was coming. Grace listened. Her parting advice, as Diana recalled it, "It will only get worse." No palace document has ever surfaced laying out formal criteria for Charles's bride. Claims about official requirements around virginity or lineage don't survive scrutiny of the primary record, and legal scholars note explicitly that no such rule existed in royal law. But the cultural expectation was fully operational. Diana was young, aristocratic, British, and without a public romantic history. She was photogenic in a way the cameras returned to obsessively. She was, crucially, unknown enough to be shaped, sufficiently unformed that the institution could write itself onto her. One biographer described her limited formal education as having enhanced her appeal. That sentence, read carefully, tells you exactly what kind of appeal was being assessed. She had met Charles 13 times by her own later count, before the engagement was announced to the world. By the time she arrived for fittings at Brook Street under a false name, she had been publicly transformed from a nursery assistant in Pimlico into the future Princess of Wales, and she was still working out how to hold a handbag correctly at royal events. The girl being fitted for a 25-foot train was homesick for Earl's Court. On July 29, 1981, an estimated 750 million people watched the ceremony on television. That figure comes from Guinness World Records, which holds it as the largest TV audience for a wedding. Wikipedia notes explicitly that there are no means of independently verifying the methodology behind the count. What isn't in dispute: 28.4 million people watched in the United Kingdom alone on BBC and ITV. Nearly 100 television companies broadcast the ceremony across 50 countries. The National Grid reported a massive surge in power demand the moment the service ended, as if the whole country had been holding its breath and then moved simultaneously to put the kettle on. 2 million spectators lined the procession route through London. The country had declared a national holiday. The BBC's television coverage had begun at 7:45 a.m., presented by Angela Rippon and Peter Woods, 3.5 hours before the ceremony started. Radio commentators were stationed at intervals along the processional route. The cameras were everywhere, inside the cathedral, outside on the steps, at Buckingham Palace, at every fixed point along the procession. 3 choirs, 3 orchestras, and a fanfare ensemble played inside St. Paul's. The choir conductor Barry Rose, who was there, later told the documentary that his choristers had been given sick bags for the occasion. For a television event of that scale, the dress needed to function at distance. The Emanuels had measured St. Paul's Cathedral's aisle before cutting the first fabric, ensuring the train would pool smoothly across the full length of the nave. St. Paul's had been chosen over Westminster Abbey specifically because it offered more seating, 3,500 guests, and permitted a longer procession through the streets of London. Scale was the organizing principle from the beginning. Elizabeth Emanuel described the design brief in terms that were entirely spatial. "We had no guidelines or instructions, so we came up with this amazing, completely OTT gown that we knew would stand out on the steps of St. Paul's." The ivory silk taffeta was bright enough to read clearly on television transmission technology of the era. The 25-foot train remained visible on screen throughout the full 3.5-minute walk up the aisle. The puffed sleeves and full skirt created a silhouette legible even on the small cathode ray screens most British households owned in 1981. No surviving Emanuel interview explicitly states the dress was designed with television transmission as a formal commission brief. The connection between the cathedral's spatial requirements and the camera's requirements is an inference. A reasonable one, but an inference. What is documented is that St. Paul's was the design's primary reference. St. Paul's happened to be a camera set. In September 1981, Harper's and Queen described Diana as the most beautiful bride anyone could dream of, and praised the ivory silk taffeta, the hand-embroidered lace, the 25-foot train edged with the same sparkling lace. British Vogue, looking back at the summer season, categorized the dress within a broader moment it described as the year of the meringue. Huge taffeta confections with ruffles and lace on every neckline. Replicas surfaced within hours of the ceremony ending. Manufacturers working through the night, garments available within days for as low as £47. Pattern companies McCall's and Berta had their versions in circulation before the summer ended. Bridal designers across the United Kingdom received orders for puffed sleeves and full skirts for years afterward. Nobody watching on July 29th was reading the dress as evidence. The dress was working exactly as designed. The audience was inside the fairy tale, and the fairy tale was seamless. That condition was the dress's greatest achievement and its most complete act of concealment. The physical events of the wedding day are documented. The symbolic reading of those events as warning signs is retrospective, and the distinction belongs here, clearly stated before the evidence is presented. What follows is what actually happened. The interpretation comes from afterward, from everything the audience would learn in the decade that followed. The morning of July 29, 1981, Clarence House. Diana was in hair and makeup before the crowds on the Mall had fully assembled. Barbara Daly was doing the bride's face, foundation, shadow, the careful architecture of a look that would need to survive a cathedral, a procession, a balcony appearance, and 3 to 4 hours of cameras at close range. Kevin Shanley had done the hair the day before. This morning it was being set in rollers, which Diana was wearing while she watched a tiny portable television in one of the house's sitting rooms. Outside the window, the Clarence House guards were changing shifts, their footsteps precise and audible in the courtyard. The crowds further down the Mall were already enormous. Police had estimated 900,000 people in the streets by 8 o'clock in the morning. David Emanuel, standing in the dressing room, later remembered asking Diana whether she'd checked the hook under her petticoat, the mechanism that held the 25-foot train in place. He had a sudden vision of the train separating from the gown halfway down the cathedral aisle. Diana reportedly found this funnier than he did. The dress itself was on a stand in the next room, with Elizabeth Emanuel watching over it. The veil was draped carefully. The bouquet, gardenias, lilies of the valley, white freesia, golden roses, white orchids, and stephanotis, was in its water container, kept cool. At some point that morning, before the dress went on, Diana spilled some of her favorite perfume on a section of the gown. Makeup artist Barbara Daly, the Emanuels, and whoever else was in the room at that moment, took a breath. The stain was small enough to hide behind the bouquet. Diana would carry her flowers at a specific angle for the rest of the day. Diana was stitched into the dress, not literally sewn in, contrary to the legend that grew up around the morning, but fitted precisely, the last measurements confirmed, the hook checked twice. Her father, John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, came downstairs when she was ready. David Emanuel was watching. He remembered. She glided down the stairs. It was a magical moment when her father looked up at her and said, "Diana, you look beautiful." She stepped out of Clarence's house and into the glass coach. The glass coach is an elegant vehicle, open-sided, glass-paneled, designed for exactly this kind of ceremonial procession, the kind of carriage that exists because being seen is the entire point of riding in it. It isn't large. The interior holds 2 people comfortably, 3 if necessary, and it isn't designed with the logistics of a 25-foot bridal train in mind, because no one had previously tried to put a 25-foot bridal train inside one. The Emanuels had not fully accounted for the relationship between the train's length and the carriage's interior dimensions. The Wikipedia article on the wedding dress, citing Andrew Morton's account in Diana, Her True Story, records the essential sequence. The designers realized, too late, that they had forgotten to allow for the train's length relative to the coach's size. The ivory taffeta had to be folded, collapsed, layered over itself, accordion-pleated like a stage curtain being struck, to fit inside the glass coach alongside Diana and her father. Earl Spencer had been in poor health. He struggled with the awkward physical choreography of the interior. By the time the carriage moved off from Clarence's house, the ivory taffeta was already under pressure. It rode through 2 miles of cheering crowds folded against its own construction. When the glass coach arrived at the steps of St. Paul's and Diana stepped out, the train emerged crushed. Visibly, photographically, undeniably crushed. The ivory silk that had been hand-embroidered over months by the Emanuel's own mothers and a studio assistant's mother emerged from the carriage with the fold lines of a garment that had been stored badly in a bag. A crew of attendants moved immediately, spritzers, smoothing hands, adjustments to the way the train lay on the stone steps. The work took a matter of minutes. A 2021 BritBox documentary featuring restored 35mm footage of the day noted that the new resolution would allow viewers to see every detail down to the creases in Diana's iconic gown as she steps out of the royal carriage. Elizabeth Emanuel was watching from behind a pillar inside the cathedral, positioned where she and David could manage the veil and train through the ceremony without appearing on camera. Her immediate reaction to the moment Diana stepped out, in her own words, "My reaction was, the dress is creased." For a moment, she was terrified. The smoothing crew worked. Diana stood still. The train was spread properly across the cathedral steps. The orchestra began playing the trumpet voluntary. Diana took her father's arm and began the 3.5-minute walk up the aisle. The wrinkling was a logistical error. A measurement was missed, and the train paid for it. Reading this as a metaphor for what followed requires a step from documented fact to symbolic interpretation, and that step is real. The script is making it consciously, and you should know that. But the error is also inseparable from the design philosophy that produced it. The train's length wasn't incidental. It was the single most deliberate choice in the gown, the one Diana had personally selected after being offered the option of 23 feet instead. The thing that made the dress what it was, its theatrical excess, calibrated for visual impact at the scale of St. Paul's Cathedral and the global television audience filling that cathedral, is also what crushed against the carriage walls for 2 miles. Form had served spectacle. The cost showed in the fabric. Exhibit B, the bodice. By the time Diana walked down the aisle, her waist measured 23 inches. Elizabeth Emanuel confirmed this figure to People magazine, and the WWD record adds the operational detail that carries the most weight. The bodice had to be remade every time Diana came in for a fitting. Not adjusted, rebuilt. The body inside the gown had been changing faster than the gown could follow, and the gown had been following as quickly as its makers could manage. The bulimia Diana described in her Morton tapes had begun during this engagement period. Multiple causes, she said herself. Attributing the weight loss solely to institutional pressure would be an overclaim. The record is more complex than a single cause, and Diana described it that way. What isn't complex is this. The dress that appeared on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral had been built for a body that no longer existed in quite the same form. The seamstresses had followed the body as it changed through 6 months of fittings. They hadn't caught it at the end. In photographs from the day, if you know to look for it, the bodice sits not quite as it was designed to sit. The alterations are visible. The evidence is in the fabric. Exhibit C, the scale. These readings are post-1997, and that provenance belongs on the record before the quotes arrive. In the cultural history Diana World, published after Diana's death, the assessment is direct. Diana was swamped by her wedding dress, just as she was in real life, literally and metaphorically. A separate study of the dress's visual legacy notes that it swallowed up Princess Diana on her wedding day. In 2004, a bridal magazine became the first major fashion publication to break with 23 years of received admiration, listing the dress as too much dress, too little princess. None of this language existed in 1981. In 1981, the overwhelming scale was the entire point. The meringue silhouette was celebrated, replicated, emulated. It became something else only when the audience had the information to look at it differently. One additional detail from the morning of July 29th that belongs in the record. Before leaving Clarence's house, Diana spilled her perfume on the gown. She hid the stain behind her bouquet throughout the ceremony. The attendants spritzed and smoothed the train. The hook under the petticoat held. The bodice, that had been rebuilt for the last time, sat as close to its design as the seamstresses could make it. Everything was managed and concealed and presented perfectly. That was the grammar of the entire occasion. The evidence about the weeks before the altar is calibrated here, and almost entirely retrospective. Its purpose is singular, to show that the dress was selling romance, while the ceremony already contained its own contradictions, visible to anyone inside the situation and invisible to everyone outside it. On February 24, 1981, the engagement interview was broadcast on ITN. When asked whether they were in love, Diana said yes immediately. Charles, asked the same question in the same broadcast with Diana standing beside him, replied, "Whatever in love means. You can put your own interpretation there." Diana giggled at his side. The ITN interview is archived and available. That answer isn't evidence of cruelty. It might be philosophical precision from a 32-year-old man who distrusted easy romantic declarations and had spent his adult life under scrutiny. But it's the public record. At the exact moment the country was invited to invest in a fairy tale, the groom offered whatever in place of yes. What followed, according to Diana's retrospective account in the Morton tapes, was this. She discovered in the weeks before the wedding that Charles was having a bracelet made for Camilla Parker Bowles. Multiple sources confirm the bracelet's existence across separate reporting. Esquire identifies the jeweler as Asprey's, with a lapis pendant bearing initials that stood for the private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other. It was given to Camilla in the days before the wedding, per those accounts. Diana, per the Morton tapes, was devastated enough to call her sisters and ask whether she might still be able to get out of it. Per the account published in Time magazine shortly after Diana's death, her sisters told her that her face was already on the tea towels. The essential caveat applies here and must be stated plainly. Everything Diana said about her state of mind in the weeks before the wedding comes from tapes recorded a decade later, when she was 30 and the marriage had collapsed. Her account is internally consistent and was later confirmed as accurate by Morton himself. But it's the retrospective account of a woman narrating a beginning she already knows the end of, in language shaped by everything that came between. That doesn't make it false. It makes it layered in a way the script can't smooth over. What is independently documented without retrospection? A 32-year-old heir apparent and a 20-year-old woman who had met him 13 times before the announcement of their engagement. A ceremony watched by an estimated 750 million people. A gown whose bodice had been rebuilt at every fitting for 6 months. A train that entered the carriage perfectly and arrived at the cathedral in creases. The wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer took place on July 29, 1981. Brixton had burned 109 days earlier. On April 10th, Metropolitan Police had deployed roughly 150 plainclothes officers across Brixton in a 10-day operation called Operation Swamp, stopping and searching more than 1,000 people in a borough where the relationship between the community and the police had already been deteriorating for years. The riots that followed, April 10th through 12th, were later described by historians as the first serious riots in 20th century England. Buildings were set on fire, cars overturned. The clashes lasted 3 days and produced injuries on both sides. A subsequent government inquiry by Lord Scarman directly examined what had gone wrong. The national press covered it as something the country hadn't seen before. English streets, English cities, burning. In the same year, Britain's GDP had contracted by approximately 2% below its 1979 level, according to an OECD economic survey published in 1981. Unemployment was climbing sharply. It would eventually peak at nearly 12% in spring 1984, but the trajectory was fully visible in 1981. Factories closing, long queues at job centers, the particular demoralization of communities where the work had been and now wasn't. The Thatcher government was barely 2 years old and navigating the worst economic conditions the country had seen since the post-war period. In the Chancellor's private correspondence from July 1981, Geoffrey Howe was writing to Margaret Thatcher about the economic situation. The timing isn't ambiguous. These letters were circulating in the same week the glass coach was being cleaned and prepared for the procession. Britain in July 1981 needed something that wasn't any of that. Police estimated 900,000 people in the streets by 8 a.m. on the morning of July 29th, before the ceremony had even begun. 2 million spectators ultimately lined the full procession route. 4,000 police and 2,200 military personnel managed the crowds, though sharpshooters were also stationed at intervals due to threat assessments involving the Provisional IRA. Around 10 million people attended street parties across the United Kingdom. The country was on a national holiday. The Archbishop of Canterbury opened the ceremony by calling it the stuff of which fairy tales are made. Commentary in the New York Times observed that even cynics felt a surge of sentimentality, and that the wedding symbolized the continuity of the British monarchy. A poet laureate wrote a poem for the occasion. There is no government document that has been found explicitly framing the wedding as a morale intervention. The cabinet record of July 1981 does not contain the words Diana and national recovery in the same sentence. That framing is structural observation, the context assembled rather than the policy documented, and the distinction matters. But the context is what it is: a country in serious economic and social pain, a national holiday declared for the occasion, an institution that needed its future to look like something worth believing in, and that had found, in one young woman with aristocratic lineage and no public romantic history, and a way of looking at the cameras that felt like eye contact, exactly the kind of future it needed. The monarchy in 1981 wasn't operating at its strongest. The Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977 had been a morale event, but that was 4 years ago. The institution needed renewal, and renewal required a story, and the story required a protagonist who hadn't yet accumulated the complications that tend to arrive with age and experience. Diana, in that frame, wasn't simply a woman getting married. She was the surface onto which an enormous collective need was being projected. Britain's appetite for good news, the monarchy's appetite for relevance, the press's appetite for a fairy tale that would sell every day rather than once a generation. The dress was the visual proof of that offering. 25 feet of ivory taffeta announcing, "Here is something worth believing in. Here is a future. Here is a fairy tale." The girl inside the dress had been homesick for Earl's Court for months, standing still in a Mayfair studio while her bodice was remade for what would turn out to be the last time. In September 1997, Time magazine published its retrospective on Diana's death. Looking back at the footage from July 29, 1981, the writer framed it directly. It seems impossible that the shy 20-year-old in the sumptuous fairy tale dress could somehow have seen a future with the dutiful, tweed-clad monarch in waiting. Impossible. As if the mismatch had always been legible, as if the evidence had been present for anyone paying attention. It hadn't been, or rather, it had been present but unreadable, because the conditions for reading it hadn't been assembled yet. Those conditions took 16 years to build. The Morton biography in 1992 publicly revealed Diana's bulimia, her isolation, her sense of being consumed by the institution she had entered. The Dimbleby biography in 1994, in which Charles's official biographer confirmed the resumption of the relationship with Camilla after the marriage effectively ended. The Panorama interview in November 1995, in which Diana told Martin Bashir the marriage had been a bit crowded with 3 people in it. The divorce finalized on August 28, 1996. The death in Paris, August 31st, 1997. Each event added another layer to the interpretive frame, another transparency laid over the original image. By the time the dress went on public display in 1998, visitors were standing in front of a garment that had accumulated a second history alongside its original one. The object itself hadn't changed. Both readings live inside the dress simultaneously. The fairy tale that hundreds of millions of people watched in 1981, and the evidence that was always in the fabric, waiting for the right information to arrive. The photographs from July 29th are genuinely beautiful, and the ceremony was genuinely moving. None of that is canceled by what came after. But Diana's own words, recorded on the Morton tapes at age 30, frame what the day had actually required of her. 1 minute she was nobody, the next minute she was Princess of Wales, mother, media toy, member of the family. And it was just too much for one person to handle. The retrospective reading of the dress as symptom, Diana's body shrinking under pressure, the spectacle's scale overwhelming the person it was meant to celebrate, developed entirely after 1992. No one assembled that reading in 1981. In 1981, the audience was inside the fairy tale, watching exactly what the dress had been built to show them. In July 1998, 10 months after Diana died in Paris, the dress went on display at Althorpe House in Northamptonshire, the Spencer family seat, where Diana had grown up after 1975, when her father inherited the earldom. The exhibition was called Diana, a Celebration, and included 150 artifacts from her life: tiaras, designer gowns, family heirlooms, letters, paintings, videos. The dress was the gravitational center. The exhibition ran, in various touring configurations, until August 2014. Proceeds of more than £1.2 million went to the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, supporting the charities she had previously backed. Ownership of the dress had passed after Diana's death to her estate, then to her brother, Charles Spencer. Diana had left specific instructions. Her personal belongings were to transfer to her sons when both had turned 30. In 2014, that threshold was reached. William and Harry became joint owners. In 2021, they agreed to loan the dress for the Royal Style in the Making exhibition at Kensington Palace, where it went back on public display, in the same palace where Diana had lived during her marriage, in the same building her sons now use as a working residence. In his 2003 memoir, A Royal Duty, Paul Burrell recorded that Diana had wanted the dress placed in the Victoria and Albert Museum's fashion collection, to be read as cultural artifact rather than family possession. She hadn't managed to arrange it before she died. The dress ended up in a palace, which is, in some sense, where it had always been heading. The Emanuels kept every document, every sketch, every toile, every fabric swatch, every design note from the Brook Street studio, locked in 4 trunks for more than 20 years after the wedding. They published a memoir in 2006, A Dress for Diana, and opened the trunks for the first time publicly. Elizabeth Emanuel noted in 2011 that she still received requests for replicas. A 2018 Time magazine feature named the dress one of the 12 most influential British royal wedding dresses of all time. The consensus that it held since September 1981 had already shown its first crack. A 2004 bridal magazine described the gown as too much dress, too little princess. 4 words, but they mark the exact reversal. The scale that had been the point became the problem. Same garment, same measurements, same 25-foot train. The context had changed, and changing the context had changed what the object was capable of meaning. There is also this. The sapphire and pearl choker Diana is photographed wearing in later years follows a similar pattern. A piece of jewelry with its own documented history, worn, photographed, displayed, is read backward through what came after. The earlier images acquiring weight and complication they couldn't have carried at the moment they were taken. The dress was the first object to undergo this transformation, and it was the largest one, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. The dress sits in museum lighting now, still, visited by people who know how the story ends, who have watched it on screen, read it in biographies, processed it through the accelerating retrospective of the years since August 1997. The bodice that was rebuilt at every fitting through 6 months of fittings looks complete from the outside, finished, exactly right. Its train pools on the floor in the same ivory taffeta that was crushed against the walls of the glass coach and smoothed back into shape before the cameras could hold it long enough to record the damage. Somewhere in that fabric are the fold lines from the carriage. Whether you can see them or not depends on the angle of the light. The wedding dress of Diana Spencer is evidence in a case that was never formally opened. It records, in silk and antique lace and 10,000 hand-sewn mother-of-pearl sequins, the distance between what an institution required and what a person could bear. That distance wasn't visible in 1981. The audience was too deep inside the fairy tale to read it from outside. Diana herself, on those tapes made 10 years later, gave it its most precise formulation. 1 minute she was nobody, and then too many things at once, and it was just too much for one person to handle. By the time the distance became visible, the institution had moved on, and the person was gone. The dress did what the monarchy asked it to do. It made a frightened 20-year-old look like a fairy tale. That was the problem. Subscribe for more stories like this.